South Korea has announced to conditionally suspend the expiry of GSOMIA and put a temporary pause on WTO complaint over Japan's export curbs on November 22nd.
우리 정부는 언제든지 한일 군사 비밀 정보 보호 협정의 효력을 종료시킬 수 있다는 전제하에 2019년 8월 23일 종료 통보의 효력을 정지시키기로 하였으며 일본 정부는 이에 대한 이해를 표하였습니다.
GSOMIA is a military intel sharing pact signed between Seoul and Tokyo in 2016, which had been renewed every year. However, South Korea announced not to extend the pact amid the heightening bilateral tensions sparked by Japan's export curbs. Under the GSOMIA agreement, the two sides had 3 months until midnight of November 23rd to negotiate the extension of the pact. But Seoul and Tokyo have not been making any significant progress on it despite engaging in a series of talks. However, South Korea had decided to conditionally extend GSOMIA at 6 p.m. on November 22nd, just 6 hours before the pact was set to expire. In spite of new frictions having flared between the two sides after Seoul's announcement on November 22nd, South Korea and Japan are making significant progress in thawing the frayed bilateral relations. The two sides have held working-level talks on an upcoming bilateral summit where two leaders are set to discuss issues related to Tokyo's export controls.
Hello, welcome to The Point. I'm your host, Daniel Che. South Korea is conditionally extending GSOMIA, and now the fate of the intel sharing pact with Japan largely depends on whether Tokyo will retract its retaliatory trade measures. For an in-depth look into the future of bilateral ties from this decision onwards, we turn to a number of experts from inside and outside of the nation. So, let's get to the point. And to help us dissect today's topic into digestible bites, we're joined by Professor Lee Yeon from Handong International Law School. Thank you so much for making time for us today.
Thanks for having me back.
Good to have you back with us. Of course, our topic today is GSOMIA and how the conditional extension of GSOMIA was announced by Korea, and this was happening just 6 hours before the pact was set to expire.
This was a completely unexpected move on the Moon administration. I think most people expected them to just let the agreement die off, especially after they indicated in August that they would not renew the agreement. There was a series of talks between both sides in terms of whether or not they could resolve this issue. But at the point where they were going to decide whether or not to actually go forward with renewal, it didn't seem like there was any softening of the stance from the Japanese side as to whether or not they would resolve this question. And so for the Korean side now to indicate that it was not going to renew the agreement, but now 6 hours before the deadline to renew it was a real complete surprise for most people.
Right, it took everyone by surprise, and it seemed like maybe it was a last-minute decision, possibly?
Yeah, I think the gambit here was really to put pressure on the Japanese side, and it's unclear as to what concessions the Japanese made on this particular question. As you recall, the reason for threatening to get out of GSOMIA was to put pressure on the Japanese to put Korea back on the white list. Now, this, of course, engendered a flurry of activity from the United States, from Japan, in order to keep Korea within the orbit of this security pact. But essentially, the Korean government was trying to pressure the Japanese to make a move on the question of the white list.
Right. It looks like the South Korean government is putting an exclamation mark with this gesture, emphasizing that the outcome of the talks would depend on Tokyo's attitude. What does Korea need from Japan to keep on this track, as in keep this GSOMIA pact alive?
Right. Well, Korea was using this as a bargaining chip. And the fact that they were willing to terminate GSOMIA was really an indication for both to Japan and the United States that Korea was willing to play hardball on this issue. And the fact that now was some activity from the United States to get involved in this crisis. And from the Japanese side, of course, even though they didn't publicly say to the Koreans or to anyone else that they were willing to concede, there's some indication that maybe Japan was making some moves to alleviate the situation. There's been reports potentially that the Japanese were floating an idea that they may put Korea back on the white list in about a month or so. So basically, the point of the Koreans to do this with respect to GSOMIA was really to indicate that they were willing to really take this very seriously.
Right. Japan was not very responsive when it comes to coming back to the dialogue table with South Korea, but it maintained contact when it comes to GSOMIA deadline. Did the intel sharing pact keep Tokyo on its toes somewhat?
I think it's hard to say whether or not they were pushed eventually on this issue by the Korean side. Certainly, that has to be a consideration. And eventually, of course, the United States did get itself involved in this matter. As we saw with various State Department officials coming to the region, there were talks by Secretary Pompeo with his counterparts in Japan and Korea. And so certainly the Japanese were put on notice that the Koreans were not going to necessarily leave this as it was. I think the Japanese were happy just to see whether or not Korea would blink on the question. And to the point where now Korea has used some brinksmanship to try to put pressure on Japan so that it would concede on this question. Eventually, we'll have to see, because it remains to be seen whether or not Japan will ultimately move forward by putting Korea back on the white list.
All right, Professor, we're going to expand our conversation to an expert from outside of the country. Let's bring in a guest from Japan and find out Tokyo's reaction to Seoul's announcement. We connect to Geoffrey Kingston, Professor of Asia Studies at Temple University's Japan campus via Skype. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Well, Korea is suspending its decision to terminate GSOMIA. How is Japan reacting to this latest development?
Well, I think the Moon's decision to pull back from the precipice and to not terminate GSOMIA took everybody by surprise. So I think everybody was prepared for this to, further escalate. And now Moon has taken a very statesman-like position and begun the process of de-escalating. So I think right now in Tokyo, they're still processing this. Of course, there was a little bit of, on the news, sort of triumphalism, like we got them to blink first. But I think they realize that this isn't really going to play too well. And I think that the Abe cabinet realizes the ball is now in their court. I think Washington clearly pressured Seoul to make this concession with the understanding that Japan will also make a concession. And so that's why I think we have ongoing talks. The South Korea withdrew its petition to the WTO. So I think that South Korea has made the first move, and I think now it's up to Tokyo to reciprocate.
Professor Kingston, before announcing this decision, Seoul initially planned to terminate the pact if Tokyo is unwilling to seek resolution. From here on, could we see dialogue to help thaw ties?
Well, it does appear there's been back-channel dialogue going on. I think that the talks are ongoing. Right now, it's really hard to predict. I'd say that, they backed away from a disaster, but it doesn't mean they're out of the woods yet. There's a lot of room for them to try to build or rebuild trust and better relations. But, it's hard to predict. There's always something that gets in the way. Clearly, the two countries' shared history makes for lots of reasons to have issues. And I think the tensions are not likely to go away too soon. My view is maybe it's time for the state actors to step back a bit and perhaps look to non-state actors to try to make some headway on resolving what is at the core of this dispute, which is the forced labor issue. And perhaps Japanese companies can work with South Korean counterparts, civil society groups, and try to come up with some sort of mechanism solution that might help resolve the forced labor issue. But again, we've gone there with the Comfort Women deal in 2015, and very predictably, inevitably that unraveled and led to even further mutual recriminations. So one finds it difficult to be particularly optimistic that the two countries will manage their shared history and to try to build a future-oriented relationship. Recall back in '98, there was the Kimobuchi Declaration, future-oriented relationship. But the past keeps hovering over that future, and it casts a very long shadow.
Right, and likely the focal point of the dialogue would be the export curbs. If Japan continues the measure, South Korea could once again push for GSOMIA termination. What do you think Japan's next move would be?
Well, I think the chances of terminating GSOMIA now are fairly low. I think Japan would really have to do something totally outrageous to provoke that. I think that Japan needs to do is to review its sanctions against South Korea and reinstall it on its white list. And I think it needs to make some, diplomatic noises. And so now that Moon has shown that he can be a statesman, I think it's time for Abe to demonstrate that he too can be a statesman and try to overcome their emotions to try to build a stronger relationship. And this isn't just in terms of the alliance with the United States, but these are two neighbors with so much in common. And, they've shared values, shared systems, shared market economy, shared problems and challenges. So there's a lot of things that they can cooperate on. And one would hope that they can sort of try to engage in confidence-building measures based on sort of non-political, non-historical issues that can help restore trust and, help nudge the leaders towards a greater resolution of the other problems that face them. But again, my view is, Japanese companies were able to resolve a similar labor dispute with Chinese plaintiffs who complained about forced labor there during the wartime. And I think that this could be a model for South Korea. But up until now, the government has been discouraging Japanese companies from doing so. Hopefully, it will now encourage them.
All right, Geoffrey, thank you for your time and your contribution today.
Goodbye. It's been a pleasure chatting to you.
We'll talk to you again soon. Now, coming back to Professor Lee, it looks like President Moon Jae-in's ability to negotiate with Japan might have been receiving a different second take by the Japanese government with this move to extend GSOMIA conditionally.
Right, I think that was sort of the olive branch potentially that the Japanese potentially were waiting for on this question. But this is all about perception at this point. And as the two sides are trying to explain what happened in this recent episode with the withdrawal of not terminating the GSOMIA, is that the Korean side, of course, is going to make the point that the Japanese were willing to make concessions. And then the Japanese side, of course, is going to say, well, we didn't make any concessions, and that we have to further discuss this issue. And so at this point, the question is not whether or not they will move forward on this question, but I think politically, whether each side will eventually come to the point where they will agree to make a deal on this question.
All right, Professor, we'll continue this conversation after taking a look at a clip that we've prepared. On November 22nd, the South Korean government said it would temporarily halt pursuing WTO complaint over Japan's retaliatory trade measures. Here's a clip about the decision before moving on to further discussions.
In addition to announcing the conditional extension of GSOMIA, South Korea also prevented its ties with Japan from further worsening by stating it would temporarily put a pause on pursuing a WTO complaint after 144 days since Tokyo placed its export curbs.
한일 간 수출 관리 정책 대화가 정상적으로 진행되는 동안 일본 측의 3개 품목 수출 규제에 대한 WTO 제소 절차를 정지시키기로 하였습니다.
Seoul and Tokyo have been entangled in a prolonging dispute since Japan imposed export controls on 3 sensitive chip materials on July 1st. Japan also took South Korea off from its list of trusted trading partners on August 2nd. In response to the trade measures, Seoul also revised its whitelist by downgrading Tokyo from A1 to a newly created subcategory A2 on August 12th. On August 22nd, South Korea also declared it would not extend GSOMIA, accusing Japan's trade measures caused drastic influences on its regional security. As Japan continued to remain adamant about retracting the trade curb, South Korea could not help but file a WTO complaint over Japan's export controls on 3 sensitive chip materials on September 11th.
이에 정부는 우리나라의 이익을 보호하고 정치적 목적으로 교역을 악용하는 행위가 반복되지 않도록 일본의 조치를 WTO에 제소하기로 하였습니다.
South Korea concluded that Japan's export curbs are not only politically motivated and discriminatory, but also violate key WTO principles which ban regulations on export volumes and unfair measures being deliberately carried out. The WTO petition begins with 2 months of consultation between the plaintiff and the defendant. Should the two sides fail to settle the case, the WTO panel would be established and discuss the following complaint. If the case does not get settled, even after being sanctioned by the panel, the appellate body will review the case before the dispute settlement body comes up with the final ruling. After filing the complaint, Seoul and Tokyo have met on October 11th and November 19th for consultations, but have failed to narrow their opinions. The dispute settlement has been put on hold by South Korea while the dispute settlement body was preparing to establish a panel. It remains to be seen how the South Korea-Japan dialogue would unfold, as Seoul said it would temporarily pause pursuing the complaint while the two sides negotiate on the export control issue.
South Korea filed the WTO complaint over Japan's export curbs on 3 sensitive items that's very important to manufacturing some important products, export products for South Korea, as in semiconductor materials. So why is Seoul putting it on hold for now?
Well, initially, when the Korean government decided to bring a complaint to the WTO, it did so primarily on the grounds that the general agreements on tariff and trades were being violated, that the WTO principles of free trade were being violated by Japan. And so that was sort of the legal question at play with respect to the complaint. But of course, this is also has to be seen in the political dimension, that the reason why the WTO complaint was put on Japan was to put political pressure on Japan to signal to everyone else that maybe Japan was not following the rules of the international trading system. So for Korea now to withhold or to sort of put a pause on the complaint is really, I think, to signal to the Japanese side that they are willing to negotiate, that they're willing to talk, and they're not going to be inflexible on the question about this particular issue. And so I think this is basically a signal to the Japanese that the Korean side is willing to negotiate on this question and is willing to withdraw itself from the WTO if things go well on the Japanese side.
So before we press the pause button, how far or deep were we into the settlement, the dispute settlement, that is?
We're basically at the very beginning stages. So when Korea brings its complaint to the WTO, there's a consultation process. And it's the stage where both sides are asked to basically talk it over. And basically around 60 days, parties have to talk it over on these kinds of questions. And so as we see, Korea and Japan had about 2 rounds of talks in Geneva, which expectedly got nowhere. Because even though this is a legal question, really the political issue is really at stake on this question. And so therefore, the issue, whether or not this will go forward, really comes down to the question of whether the political issue will ultimately be dealt with in a satisfactory way.
So what about the resumption of dispute settlement after, if by any chance the two sides fail to reach a resolution?
Well, Korea basically is in the driver's seat on that question as the complainant. So if after 60 days they haven't reached any agreement as to resolving this question diplomatically, then Korea can call for the establishment of a panel. Now, Japan could, of course, object to the establishment, but basically, after initial objection, Usually what happens is then the panel is eventually convened on the question, and then the panel will ultimately make a decision based on WTO law whether or not Japan has in fact violated the principles of GATT. And so at this point, Korea really has to decide. If this doesn't go forward in a satisfactory way, then Korea can push this forward and then resume the dispute resolution process.
All right, we're going to bring in another expert to expand our horizons and increase the depth of our discussion. Let's have a chat with an American expert through Skype. We are joined by Raj Bala, a distinguished professor at University of Kansas Law School and senior advisor at Denton's. Welcome to our program.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here with us. South Korea has tentatively suspended WTO dispute settlement over Japan's trade curbs. Your thoughts on Seoul's decision?
It's a very significant decision, and it's very good news because it suggests that South Korea feels that Japan is willing and able to compromise and respond to South Korea's legitimate concerns about Japanese export restraints. And so, at least for the time being, there's no need to resolve the disputes through litigation at the WTO, but rather to do so through diplomatic negotiations.
Professor Bala, are there many instances in the past when WTO settlements were suspended with the two sides trying to resolve it through dialogue, but then eventually was resumed after talks failed?
Since the WTO and its dispute settlement system were born on the 1st of January 1995, almost a quarter century ago, there have been 573 cases brought before the WTO. About 41% of those cases have settled during the consultation phase. In about 58% of the cases didn't settle and a panel was necessary. A panel report was issued in about 44% of the cases. In other words, sometimes during the panel phase, the cases settled. So in about 44% of the cases, we've had a panel report. And then of those cases in which there's been a panel report, about 2/3, 67%, have gone on to appeal and had an appellate body report. So what these numbers tell you, and these are statistics from the WTO, is that we get settlements in nearly half the cases, about 41%. In the other 60% of the cases, we need a panel or the appellate body to resolve the dispute. So, you know, the Korea-Japan case would fit right within these overall statistics, about a 40% chance of settling, about a 60% chance going on to litigation at the panel and/or appellate body stage.
Right now, it seems Japan is interested in talking with Korea about resolving the trade dispute. What do you think Japan's next step would be?
I think Japan's next step is going to be to make renewed and even more serious efforts to resolve the dispute with Korea. And I think, frankly, the one-word motivation for Japan to do so is China. The Sino-American trade war is impacting adversely trade in Asia and trade across the world, as well as GDP growth. And the U.S.-Japan free trade agreement, which was signed last month, is not yet in effect. It's not even yet been submitted to Congress. And in fact, there probably are more negotiations to be had between the U.S. and Japan. So from Japan's perspective, it wants to get the robust trade with Korea resumed. And it amidst this bleak global economic climate caused by the Sino-American trade war and the uncertain fate of what's to come with the new free trade agreement with Japan. So to put it simply, what Japan does not need is a headache in its trade relations with Korea.
All right, thank you so much, Raj, for your time and your insights. We do appreciate it.
It's a great pleasure to have been with you. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and goodbye.
Goodbye. We'll talk to you again soon. Coming back to you, Professor, if negotiations run smooth and Japan decides to lift its trade curbs, what would be the optimal procedure and timeline, optimal in terms of how it would be beneficial for Korea?
Well, the end game, I think, for the Korean side on this question is going to be putting Korea back on its white list, on Japan's white list. And so presumably that would require the cabinet decision from the Japanese side to put Korea back on the white list, and then the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry to actually implement this with respect to Korea. And so if all goes well, then Korea would also respond, of course, in kind by withdrawing its complaint from the WTO and then creating, as I think the professor mentioned, some avenue for the compensation to be given to those individuals who were the victims of forced labor. Even recently, I think there have been reports now that the Speaker of the National Assembly is preparing a bill to create that kind of avenue for compensation to be made. So it seems like there's all indications that this is moving in the right direction. And so I think for the Korean side, this could take a very short time if, in fact, there's the political will to move this forward by the time the two leaders meet, in fact, very soon to have their summit.
There was a time when the leaders of South Korea and Japan, when they were seen in the international stages, the frosty ties was quite visible in the way they posed for pictures, and they didn't even make a lot of eye contact. More recently, they actually sat down and held talks for a significant amount of minutes. So in the upcoming summit in China, it's possible a summit could be held between Seoul and Tokyo. How do you see this event unfolding now that we've seen some gradual baby step progress?
Again, it's going to be the political will of the parties. And so I suspect that there's going to be a lot of frantic energy as well as activity, both from the Blue House and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in terms of pushing this forward so that the two leaders can have something to actually agree on. So I think what's going to happen is there's going to be, I think, carrots and sticks given from both sides to indicate that they're serious about this issue, that they can always pull back and terminate GSOMIA or keep Korea off the white list, but also a lot of incentives, I think, being pushed around as well to make sure that the sides realize that there's an avenue for this to be resolved to a point where then the two leaders meet, and then maybe an agreement in principle comes out of this, where then they can de-escalate and then go back to the situation before this all happened.
Right. Let's hope they can bury the past and move forward together. Looks like we'll have to let you go, Professor Lee Hyun. We thank you so much for coming in and making our program complete today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Tension still lingers despite GSOMIA being kept alive at the last minute. We hope the two sides can solve the dispute through dialogue and diplomacy rather than ultimatums. That's all we have for you at this hour. Do join us again same time next week for a brand new episode of The Point. Thank you for watching.